Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've decided to do yet another historical video. And with today being Cinco de Mayo, or the 5th of May, I've decided to have a look at a bizarre piece of history from Mexico. Specifically, how Mexico became a pioneer in tank development during World War I. Something that I suspect that not a lot of people know about. So today, let's talk about the TNCA Salinas Tank. Before I get into it though, I should mention that there is not really a whole lot of information on this tank, or even the TNCA company that produced it. As such, I am very limited on the sources that I have available, but nevertheless, I will be leaving a link in the description to both of them. But to get started, I believe first of all, it is important to know that Mexico wasn't exactly a nation well suited for tank development during World War I, as the country was especially unstable at this time, as it was, after all, right in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. And for those curious, I have in fact gone into far greater detail on how bad things truly were in Mexico at the time during my video talking about the Battle of Ambos Nogales. And so I'll be leaving a link in the description to that as well for those who want to see that. But suffice it to say, the combination of such political instability alongside the fact that Mexico was at the time not a particularly industrious nation meant that Mexico was just not well suited to making tanks at the time. But nevertheless, that did not stop the fine folks at TNCA. And you may be wondering who exactly were TNCA. Well, the TNCA, or Talleres Nacionales de Construcciones Aeronáuticas, or National Aircraft Construction Factories, was a company dedicated to producing military aircraft for the Mexican government, and was started in either 1915 or 1917, depending on which source you want to use. With the factory now in place, let's now move on to the designer of this so-called Salinas tank, Mr. Salinas himself, whose full name was Major Alberto Salinas Carranza, and was a nephew of the then sitting Mexican president, who at some point during 1916 or 1917 came up with this design, which was heavily inspired by, aka ripped off, the British Mark I, although obviously there were a number of differences, perhaps the most notable being that while there were guns in the side sponsons, the main armament of the Salinas tank came in the form of a 5-barreled Hotchkiss rotary cannon mounted to the front of the tank. Now, some sources suggest that this is a 47mm cannon, however, it is widely believed that that is a typo, and instead this particular tank was equipped with a 5-barreled 37mm cannon instead. Although you may have noticed that instead of creating special armored plating to fit the main gun within, the designers of the Salinas tank decided to take the gun shield that was already on the cannon and merely mount it internally into the tank. Now, neither of the sources that I have mention the problems with designing a tank's armor layout in this way. However, given how both obvious and severe it is, I believe I have to cover it on my own here. So for a start, it is worth noting that this is going to significantly weaken the strength of the armor in that area. And given that this is in the front of the tank, where a good number of the crew are supposed to be housed, that is obviously not a good idea. Worse still, this armor layout could even act as something of a shot trap. And if the gaps between the gun shield itself and the actual hull of the tank are significant enough, bullets could at least in theory pass through these gaps and inside to the tank, which is probably not an intended design feature. Worst of all, however, is the fact that even if the gun shield itself is able to deflect a shot, there is a chance that the blow might be severe enough to dislodge it from the hull and thus have it go flying into the faces of the crew. Now granted, it's most likely that any shot that was capable of doing that would have most likely penetrated anyways, but nevertheless it is very much a problem worth noting, and historically it has been an issue severe enough to see redesigns in other more famous tanks. This is why, for example, the Soviet T-34s from World War II saw a redesign in their driver hatch, as the early version of the driver hatch had a tendency to showcase this exact same problem. Another issue that my sources do actually note is the fact that the escape hatches for the Salinas tank are located in front of the machine gun sponsons, meaning that in an emergency the crew would have to bail out exposed to enemy fire, whilst at the same time being unable to return fire from those particular sponsons. Outside of this, however, there is not a whole lot of information available about the tank's design, as we don't even know what engine it was designed for, or even if such an engine was actually fitted into the tank. Although credit where credit is due, TNCA did in fact build aircraft engines, and it is most certainly possible that at least one of those could have been fitted to this design. But with all the faults that I have mentioned in the Salinas tank design, and yes, there are a lot of them, and pretty severe ones as well, credit where credit is due, the tank did at least have some good ideas also. For a start, placing the viewport higher up for the commander would have most certainly improved visibility. Curiously though, this tank may have actually been surprisingly well suited to fighting other tanks specifically, given the fact that it relied upon a relatively rapid-fire rotary cannon as its main armament, at a time when tanks were only really designed to withstand rifle fire. Thus, even a relatively low-velocity shell from a 37mm cannon would have been more than sufficient to deal with whatever armor was available at the time. But now that I've talked about the design, let's talk about the fate of the Salinas tank. Now, there are rumors that it may have seen combat during the Mexican Revolution or during the Cestero War. However, these appear to be just simply that, rumors. It is known, however, that sometime during the 30s, the tank was converted into a guard outpost after having its weapons removed, before most likely being unceremoniously scrapped. TNCA would also be closed in 1930, although it was briefly revived in both 1941 and 1947, and thus ends the story of Mexico's efforts at being a pioneer in tank production. Once again, I know there's a lot of details missing, but unfortunately there isn't really a whole lot of information available out there for this tank. That said, it is nevertheless a bizarre and I hope interesting story, and one that I also hope you enjoyed listening to. But in any case, this has been Ace. Hope to see you guys again soon. Take care. Ace out.